The following podcast was produced in-house for KQEK.com.
Think about it from a military perspective. When I was leading paratroopers in Afghanistan, if 98, 99% of my intelligence told me that I was driving my platoon down a road and that 2 miles down that road, there's an ambush waiting for me, I don't get to say, yeah, but there's that 1% that says there's no ambush, so the hell with the other 99%, we're gonna keep going down the road. I mean, that's negligence on an unfathomable scale. That's the debate we're having right now with regard to climate. The overwhelming consensus is we are facing a massive risk. Climate change is happening. We've got to decide whether they're going to act on it or not. And that choice has consequences.
Age of Consequences, Jared Scott's documentary on the impact of climate change, feels like a follow-up work to Davis Guggenheim's Oscar-winning An Inconvenient Truth, the 2006 filming of Al Gore's PowerPoint show that was supposed to motivate millions into realizing the serious impact of global pollution. And yet in the intervening 10 years, one can argue the measured benefits have been slight, and the willingness of nations, governments, and corporations to change bad habits have been erratic. A change in regimes and administration can put proactive plans on pause or stop them outright. And Scott's film is perhaps more provocative today in light of the great unknown that exists as President-elect Donald Trump is transitioning to take the reins of the U.S. government. Scott's film, which is currently screening at the Hot Docs Ted Rogers Cinema, isn't wholly political, but it does smack audiences in the heads by arguing that if elements of the U.S. military acknowledge current future dangers, it's clearly foolish to shrug off the issue of climate change, the warming of oceans, and the causal links between present-day wars with massive population migrations after once fertile lands have been reduced to dust bowls. In this edited conversation, Scott touches upon the film's present-day impact, its themes, and his storytelling technique, which includes the use of chapters, moments of respite for audiences, and Malcolm Francis's excellent score. I gather that when you started the film versus some of the more recent election events that have occurred, the film's meaning and impact probably have changed from your original intentions.
We did a talk last night at here in New York City with Bard College and SUNY, and it was sponsored by Foreign Affairs magazine. We showed a few excerpts of the film, and we had with us two of our interviewees, Christian Parenti, who wrote the book Tropic of Chaos, and Sharon Burke, who was a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Operational Energy. It was a difficult conversation to have because what we talked about is, this new administration, which many people are still shocked by. And I think that it's tough to know all the policies because, quite frankly, either they're very unclear or non-existent. And President-elect Trump at this point has held every possible view, it seems, that one could hold on any issue. But sadly, the issue of climate change has become a political one in this country and in other places. And I think that many countries, I think there's over 80% of the countries of the world consider climate change to be a threat to their national security. And clearly, as an American, I focused on the U.S. military because it's also very big. And so when people hear that the U.S. military is talking about this, their ears kind of perk up and people wonder, well, okay, go on. What I worry about now, based on what you saw in the film, is that, we do have civilian control over our military, which is not a bad thing. You see other countries where, militaries do not have civilian control. And we think we can all say that that's not a good thing. The unfortunate aspect in this instance is that we have somebody coming in who will serve as the commander-in-chief. And so it's a command culture, and that stuff goes top down. So what that commander-in-chief and the appointed Secretary of Defense decide to do can percolate throughout that institution. Now, it's a large institution, so people aren't just going to stop thinking about this, and you can't just scrub the records of this. But most likely, the next directive that comes out will not have these same kind of concerns about climate change.
I think for myself, what was the largest surprise is that you drew from a substantial amount of former military vets, especially several people that were in Iraq and experienced a lot of sort of ground level interaction with the locals and could see how climate change had affected. And Usually when you see interviews with military vets, you find that it deals often with combat, post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on. Whereas in this case, you had vets who had a much greater overview and were able to grasp what they experienced, what they saw, assess the repercussions of what was going on, and then in hindsight could tell that the war that occurred wasn't just from a despot that was trying to take control over the country. There were all these other factors that somehow managed to sort of create this perfect storm that is sort of rippling all over the place and is continuing.
We've targeted definitely a group of individuals that are kind of in this, what I would call a climate change and security community. I mean, they've been talking about this for a long time, and, there's been a lot of great work on this. I'm not a veteran myself, and I haven't been on the front lines. But, like I said before, I think it is a command culture. So I think that people are, if you tell them to go build bridges, they're going to build bridges. If you tell them to knock on doors and arrest people, they're going to do that. And I think that when you're following orders, you don't always have time to kind of think about all the ramifications of everything that's going on because you have a very specific task and job. I think for the average person in the military, the average person serving. I think when we looked at, some of the officers, the, rear admirals, Rear Admiral David Titley, who's in the film, he was also the former oceanographer of the military. His job is to look at climate change, is to look at weather patterns, is to understand the Arctic. Sharon Burke, her job was to come in and to look at operational energy, how fuel was being used. Because at one point, there was a report that the Army released during Afghanistan, I think it was in 2007 or before that said, 1 out of every 24 fuel convoys resulted in a casualty. So you had upwards of 7 to 8, 1 out of every 7 to 8, I think, believed men and women that died were like transporting fuel or water. And so that was the problem. So they figured out, well, how can we address this issue, of just our dependence on fossil fuel in the theater of war? But let me step back. What's interesting about the Pentagon and what we discovered in making this film is that there are a lot of people in higher positions talking about this. Like I said, it's in the directives, and we walk through this in the film. And this has been discussed since the early days of the Bush administration, and it's appeared in the kind of the bedrock, documents that the military uses. Kind of like, this is what we're doing right now as an institution. And it's called the Quadrennial Defense Review. And that came out in 2010, and there was one that came out in 2014, along with the adaptation roadmap. But all of those are very explicit about climate change. There was a new directive that just came out the end of last year, and one that the intelligence community also just released. So like you see there's tons of these documents. We go through quite a few in the film, but there's many more since we've even finished the film. It's no secret that this has been going on, but I think when people look at that at once, kind of in the aggregate, like, oh my God, there's all these people and there's all these documents. Yeah, it can give one pause. The role of the military is not to deal with climate change. Just because they're looking at it, it's not that they're solving it. There are some renewable pushes that they're making, and there's a really strong innovation pull in the military. There's been a lot of technologies that have been developed by the Pentagon, by the U.S. government. And I think in your iPhone right now, 12 of those functions were government-supported programs that had something to do with military technology. There's a lot of things that make it back to civilian society, and that's exciting. But at the end of the day, there's nothing good about war. There's nothing good about fighting. And we don't want to look to our military to solve what are civil society problems.
And then I think there's another point that's made in the documentary, which might be more surprising just in light of what tends to always be repeated in the news, and that's about the civil war in Syria, where one of the antecedents of that was a severe drought that occurred. I think it was for 3 years, and that essentially mobilized the population into the city centers. They weren't able to find any jobs. There was unrest, which led to civil unrest, which then led to protests, which then led to the government crackdown. It's all these stages that occurred. It's interesting how the climate change issue, at least from what I've seen, rarely ever makes it into the news. It's always Bashar al-Assad and how he's a corrupt regime, and it always focuses on the figurehead, but not sort of the sort of lesser known causes.
Clearly, climate change has it's played a role in this, and I think what we try to be careful with the film is not to say that climate change caused this drought and therefore caused this conflict. I mean, you always have to look at how all these factors interrelate and agitate and feed off of each other. we all know that there's these socio-political problems and that they have a way of affecting each other, that they're all interrelated. I mean, bad governance leads to unemployment. Unemployment can lead to unrest, and that unrest can lead to more government crackdown and more bad government. There's a lot of factors that are at play. I mean, you look at Assad. I mean, I think at one point Tim Brown in the film says, look, every time we have one of these conflicts, yes, it's Assad, yes, it's ISIS. Each time these ideological stories are going to be there and they're going to be true, but at the same time, you're going to have this underlying factor, which is climate, because they're all true. A lot of it is Assad's reaction to the drought, whether it's the lack of subsidies, whether it's the poor mismanagement when it comes to wells and dealing with the crisis. When we have a problem, say in Canada or the US, and there's a drought, you don't see our farmers kind of picking up and moving. There's subsidies, there's different ways to deal with it. Where if you're in Syria, you lose your crop, the next year you sell everything you have, and the third year you move. There's really not many options. So clearly Assad's government could have responded to that crisis in a way that would have prevented a lot of the problems that we saw. You're always going to have that bad governance and all those social and political problems that exacerbate that. And I think that's what we try to make clear in the film, that climate change is one of the factors. And the way that it interrelates, it can exacerbate. Not only does the political problems affect how it is that they deal with climate change, but climate change then, it, of course, exacerbates the social and political issues as well. I mean, clearly it's this web of how things happen. But yeah, you look at the influence of that drought. Now, and we look at that the autopsy report that came out in the National Academy of Sciences, where Colin P. Kelly and Richard Seeger and others said, look, looking at the data, we have declared that this drought is 2 to 3 times worse because of man-made interference, because of our use of greenhouse gases and the way that we've affected the environment. They're saying that drought is worse because of what we've done, because of how we, business as usual. And I think that is really kind of an enlightening thing. The drought would have been bad anyway. And I think this is the wild card with climate change. It's like that steroid analogy. Baseball players always hit home runs, right? But with steroids now, they're hitting them further and they're hitting them more frequently, right? So they're more extreme, they're more frequent, just like our weather. And I think that you see that in the drought in the Fertile Crescent. You're going to see that all over the globe. And I worry about more of that to come.
The documentary does end on a hopeful note in which there are these technologies that are being developed by the military, and there are these technologies that exist that will at least help the situation to some degree in terms of tempering the amount of pollution that's out there. But then you have the president-elect who has said in the past that he wants to go back to coal again, which it's just an interesting contrast where you have a forward-thinking documentary which shows a lot of forward-thinking people in the military and from former political regimes, and then you have a new regime where it seems to just tip everything completely over again, ignoring all the facts that have come out so far and all the theories, and coal is probably one of the more terrifying ones. Plus there's also the contrast where China's moving away from it because they realize they're polluting the hell out of the country, and so they've got to find something else, and there's business opportunities and alternative technologies.
Mm-hmm. And this is where it's a little out of my wheelhouse, but if you look at what God, it pains me to say this, President-elect Trump is proposed for his first 100 days. He said that he will lift restrictions on energy reserves, including shale, natural gas, and coal. Now, he called it clean coal, which I still don't believe exists. And, he wants to allow more energy projects like the Keystone Pipeline to go forward. He wants to cancel the billions of dollars of payments to the UN climate change program. We can't back out of the UNFCCC. That's not going to happen. I mean, there's some things that we just can't undo. But all these Obama executive orders, the Clean Power Plan, these things can be dismantled pretty quickly. No matter what side of the aisle you might fall on in U.S. politics or global politics, I think what we try to do, too, in this film is not have this be seen as this liberal left issue. I mean, there's been this politicization around the issue, which, I don't quite understand. I guess everything's political, and so I'm not trying to sound naive, but I don't understand why this has become so political. And I think what we wanted to use, why I think the national security perspective is refreshing, is that there's something about the institution of the U.S. military that, at least in the States, it's a trusted institution, and there's a way that it diffuses it's an apolitical institution as well. I mean, clearly people have their views, but you're not supposed to talk about those views when you're in the Pentagon. It's an apolitical institution, and it diffuses the partisanship. And look at like today's Veterans Day. I mean, you can't find anyone in this country that doesn't support the troops. Republicans, Democrats come together all the time to support the troops, and we know we have a really big budget for the military. There's always things that it's a very bipartisan kind of aspect. Now, foreign policy decisions aside, I'm not talking about some of the foreign policy decisions that the U.S. has made recently, more historically. But the institution itself is trusted. I mean, you look at, Congress right now has a 12% approval rate. I mean, you can see a lot of the reaction to the distrust of institutions, the dislike, the unhappiness with Congress, the distrust of experts and elite aspects of culture, being media, universities. You see science. You see a lot of that went into the rise of President-elect Trump. But yeah, you have the military itself is supposed to be apolitical, and that's why we wanted to embrace this. But I think that I think that people are going to. I think that people will listen to this message, and I hope that now more than ever, that maybe if there's one way to talk about this will be it. But we've definitely lost some ground on it, and I hope that the Pentagon continues to lead, as well as everybody else on the social issue front, on the environmental front. I just hope that we can all come together and recognize that climate change, that ice, whatever, water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, and all these problems are going to affect us no matter what your beliefs are.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the film's visual design, because I imagine that it drew from a number of archival sources, as well as photography that was captured around the world deliberately for the production. But there's a really interesting way that you present the arguments in terms of point chapters, the graphics that are used to sort of simplify some of the presentations, and also just the striking visuals that you use. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you designed the look and sound of the film.
I mean, I think that for a film like this, you always want to make sure that the films that we make as documentary filmmakers, that they're not considered just to be the broccoli of entertainment. You don't want to put something in front of an audience and say, hey, you should watch this. Like, this is good for you. I think that we have a duty, not just to get the story right, and not just to get the facts right. And, that's I think why we were so careful with the caveats in the film about how climate change interrelates, and really working hard on the graphical design to show that. We have to make sure that the film is artful and entertaining. We have to pull out all the stops. It's not a white paper. I mean, if you want to read the documents that we show in the film, you can. They're dry. Often a journalistic term called MIGO, my eyes glaze over. We've heard this all before. We've seen this. Clearly, in the medium of film, our job is to do everything that we can to make it entertaining. Now we have to be careful. We don't want to sensationalize it. We don't want to be alarmists. We need to treat the material with integrity. So I think that we had a responsibility to be careful with how we use the images, not over sensationalize. But yeah, we wanted to show you that these problems are real, that this is happening now, and that a lot of this stuff too is a preview of what's to come. So the graphics, as I mentioned before, we were really looking hard to find a pre-existing architecture that would show, maybe how the military thinks about this. There's a lot of people that have talked about a risk matrix, or, how these factors interrelate. But we never found a really good example that we could kind of borrow. So we had to create our own. There was something that the World Economic Forum had put together that showed risks of climate change and energy, and actually that kind of helped us as a starting point to kind of create our nexus. But yeah, as you see in the film, we really use that graphical element not just as an artful, well-designed piece, but as a mechanism for you to better understand the problem. Because as we're using beautiful aerials and beautiful graphics and news footage and slow-mo, the idea is that we have to make it clear. So you can't just make it artful and have that work. It's a really dense film. So it's kind of like everything that you use is two-pronged. It has to be visually appealing, but it also has to really make sense. It's a dense film. It moves pretty fast. If one of those images doesn't match up with what they're saying, or one of those graphics doesn't clarify the thesis, and we lose you as an audience, we haven't done our job. So it's almost like we have to our filmmaker hat on and our political science hat on at the same time.
There's two particular shots that stand out for me, and the first one, it's just one shot, and it's where, as you presented all these arguments about climate change and the melting of the ice caps and the water increasing and so on, then you have just one shot of the Maldives, and you hold on it, and it looks kind of surreal because it probably was one island or maybe composed of very tightly knitted islands together, but everything's now been built up and every square inch of the land has been maximized. And from the angle that you show it, it's very clear. When the water starts to rise, they're completely screwed. It will be a city that will be completely underwater. And it's one shot that kind of hammers home in a very simple way the danger that happens to any population that's in a vulnerable place.
We try to stay on the thesis of kind of certain case studies where you'd see conflict arise. I mean, clearly we're going to have a huge humanitarian crisis with the Maldives, and we're going to have a huge existential crisis there. I don't know if it'll lead to conflict. I think it'll just be just a huge, terrible humanitarian disaster. But yeah, we hold on that shot of the Maldives. That's the capital. I think Mali is how you pronounce it. And, I think there's upwards to 150,000 people in about a 2.2 square mile radius. It's one of the most densely populated cities in the world. And you just see how precarious that is. We hold on that because it speaks volumes without interpretation. You just see the fragility of our society, of the Maldives. You have people there that have done some of the least, have done the least amount of damage to the environment, and who are going to bear the brunt of that. Bangladesh is the other example, and there's plenty of others, all the low-lying nations in the Pacific. I mean, people that have done next to nothing compared to what the Western world has done, what we've done here in the States and in North America and China. I mean, you have them living this precarious existence, and you just see it, and you know that there's going to at some point be this mass migration. And it's so hard to fathom because you see this is not a small little village. I mean, this is a proper city that is going to be underwater.
The second image that I want to refer to is it's an aerial shot of a desert terrain. And I think prior to that shot, you've been showing Africa and the Middle East and how it's affected everybody. And as the camera keeps moving forward, all of a sudden you see a fence, you see green, you see a pool, you see a luxury house, and then as you pull a little bit higher up, then you see an entire neighborhood. And it's this sort of surreal block of kind of gated houses all bunched up together with their own little ideal environment. And outside of the fence, it's just all desert and there's nothing there. And it seems kind of surreal that you would create that kind of perfect environment in such an arid landscape. And obviously the amount of energy to maintain that artificial world has to have some tax on the environment.
Yeah, I mean, that's a shot in Southern California, and it's Timothy Snyder who's speaking under it. He says, we in the Western world, in the developed world, I think he mentions that we've sometimes, and it's obviously directed at the U.S. here, that we've confused lifestyle with life itself. And anything that we expect to change, we expect it to happen far away, somewhere out there. The idea that we would have to change doesn't often cross people's minds. And you think in that shot, you see the absurdity of this community with green grass and giant McMansions just in the middle of the desert. You think about how it is that we've structured, how we've artificially insulated and built these places where really it doesn't make much sense to live. I mean, where there isn't water, it gets pumped in, and it's just a surreal scene. Obviously, Timothy Snyder's making this profound point about how it is that we think about ourselves in the natural world, where that somehow we can just do what we want and that it'll just be okay. And that if something else has to change, well, fair enough, but we're not. We'll be fine. It's definitely a strange kind of scene. And you're right, we really kind of hold on the desert. So you get this sense of really this empty space, and then all of a sudden you have a suburban community. It really gives you time for pause. And that's one of those moments, too, where we just kind of let the audience sit, which is nice because, I mean, the film is quite fast-paced. You know, we probably could have had more breaks. But yeah, that's kind of one of those more meditative moments.
Well, I guess in reference to that, that brings to mind the way that you structured it in terms of the chapters. And there are very specific points where you actually fade out slowly and you pause. So the audience is sitting there in the darkness, and they're allowed to, just for a few moments, absorb what they've just seen, get the emotional impact of that, and then you start to ease into the next chapter. And I thought that was very effective because it doesn't occur at every single chapter, so therefore it's not an expected pause that happens. There are very specific points where the length is a little bit longer so that the audience is forced to reflect a little bit. And I think that actually is needed because it is a lot of information. And
absolutely,
the perspective is very different from what you see on the nightly news, between all the ads that always happen, in between all the little clip reports. I mean, one of the problems that I've always had with news, and this happens both in the United States and in Canada, is where ads have taken precedence over content. So what used to be maybe a 3-minute piece has been massively cut down to maybe like a minute and a half, maybe even a minute worth, where it's still a report, but it's been so severely truncated that the perspective that you get from any kind of international crisis or an important issue has been so heavily synthesized that you don't really get much of it. And often they'll just say, go to the website and you'll get the information there. But the news really is kind of become an insufficient source of actually getting broad information from a decent perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I'll kind of comment on the latter part of that, and then I'll go back to the chapters. You know, the thing about documentaries that's so important is that you're not getting these soundbite-driven moments that so happen in our news media. I lament the decrease in funding across a lot of our news desks, which I think is problematic, especially more on like local levels. I worry about, I call it the sports centerization of media. If you watch sports, you see the slam dunks, you see the highlights, but you don't see everything else. Same with our news media. You know, you really get these fragments, and with our devices now, we kind of skim through, right? I mean, a lot of people don't do deep dives anymore into exposés. It's become a skim, kind of a skim reading process. Our attention spans have gone down. I remember a few years ago, a study came out saying that the internet attention span is 3 minutes. I imagine it's shorter now.
I think it's shorter.
But that was kind of like, that was the big thing, a few years ago, and I imagine it's only gotten worse. So, a documentary comes along, you're then forced to confront an issue in 80 minutes, in 90 minutes, or longer. That's really incredibly valuable. I mean, we have to get these deep dives into these issues. And, as documentary filmmakers, too, we can take a little more, we have a bit more liberty. I mean, granted, we have to adhere to journalistic principles. You want to get the facts right. You want to do, you want to make sure that things are accurate and that there's an integrity in what it is that you're doing. But at the same time, we are artists, and we want to, as I said, we want to use beautiful images. We want to make points. We want to propose ideas. We want the audience to question. We want them to discover. We want them to explore a lot of different things. And so it's a medium that it's long form. It can be entertaining and not dry. And I think oftentimes we're reading the news, we're running around, and we go to dinner, we do our daily lives. A film hopefully sparks a discussion that it's not an ending point, but it's a starting point. That afterwards you then go and you learn more, or you go and talk to your friends, or you talk to others, or you investigate, or you question. You think about your worldview. When we release in theaters here in the U.S. in January, Canada gets a sneak peek. You guys are getting the film early, which we're excited about. We'll have more of an action guide to go with the film because we're kind of finalizing some of those partnerships and how it is that we want to direct people afterwards. But let me get back to the chapters. The chapters, I think you raise a good point. We set out to make a subject-driven film. which is difficult, which is quite a challenge as a filmmaker and storyteller. It's different than a character-driven film. We are not following one person on a journey or several people. You get to know our interviewees. You get to know kind of this community. These ensemble voices start to speak as one. That's what happens in a dialectic. But you don't get to see Rear Admiral David Titley at his home. You don't see, Sharon Burke struggling with some kind of moment of where there's an inciting incident at some point, like in other films. As a subject film, you have to then figure out thematically how you're going to organize this information. And I think what helps us with chapters is it's such a dense topic that if we don't bracket the information off for the viewer, it might just run together. And you want to try to avoid that run-on sentence. We did this with our last film, Requiem for the American Dream, as well. We created 10 chapters. And I do like that style in a subject-oriented film. It's a good technique. So you're right. Not only do we organize the material in these kind of blocks, but it gives you time to pause. Sometimes you need to cue the audience so they know, okay, I just walked through that information. I need to take a breath, understand what that was, and know that I'm now moving on to something else. And the way that those work within the blocks, intra-chapter, and then how they work inter is really important. And in the way that those develop and give you kind of a sense of where you're at.
And then I've just got two more quick questions.
Sure.
The first one is in regards to the composer. I just wonder if you can talk about how you work with the composer to create the score, because it's an interesting score that kind of draws a little bit from minimalism, but at the same time, it seems to go after a very specific mood, and then there's certain sequences where that mood is sort of sustained, kind of like holding on a chord and making it kind of unrelenting until eventually it eases into the next sequence.
Malcolm Francis is the composer, and he's composed all the films that we've worked on, Requiem for the American Dream, Disruption, Do the Math, a number of others. He's really a fantastic composer. The way that we work is usually we try to find the right tone, and Malcolm likes to, clearly he likes to compose to picture. But when you're building a film and it's not locked, you don't always have that luxury, and we feed off the music as well. And I'm a musician. Going back to the idea of like whether it's graphics or aerials or, all this stuff that makes these films entertaining, music is a big part of it. It helps us as editors to cut with it, to work with it, to find the right tone. It's really this back and forth process where, we inspire each other. But usually what we do is we send him some sections, we try to get the tone right. He'll come up with a number of different tracks that have different tonalities. We'll put them in. Sometimes we need to pull back, and other times, we want to ramp it up. In this film, we had to be really careful because it's such a delicate subject. It's pretty grim already. We tried really hard not to over-sensationalize anything. There's going to be some explosions. There's going to be some crescendos in the music, but you don't want to have the drums and the swells that make it feel too much. Clearly there's moments like the title. There's the nuclear crescendo at the end of, I think, chapter 7 or 8. It's one of those moments where it really peaks, and there is a relentlessness to the music. And I might be getting too much into the minutia here, but the actual melodies, the phrasing are, they're spread out over 32 bars. And what's interesting about that is it's like the feeling of that is relentless, but it's not this incessant melody that's hitting you over and over. It's really drawn out. It's really pulled apart. So if you actually listen to it, you're like, oh, wow, that's the melody. And it's taking me a long time to hear it, because you also don't want to just have some kind of thumping, nondescript background texture all the time. It's kind of this pulled apart style that he embraced in this film. And I think it works out really well.
And then my last question is just in terms of, will the film receive a home video release, either physical or digital?
Yeah, absolutely. It will. We do have distribution throughout Canada, throughout the US, and worldwide. You will be able to get that in the new year.
I can remember once getting in a discussion with a career civilian at the Department of Defense who was expressing concern about talking about climate change and said, we have to use language that doesn't offend people, that doesn't say this is really happening. And I just looked at him and I said, that's incompatible with US government policy. And I cited all these reports and said, you need to look at what your own government is saying and work from that.
Special thanks to director Jared Scott for his generous time, and Andrea Smitko at the Hot Docs Ted Rogers Cinema for facilitating this interview. If you like this podcast, please visit KQEK.com's Facebook page and follow our Twitter feed at mondomark_KQEK. All podcasts are available via Libsyn, iTunes, and YouTube. The editorial skills responsible for this podcast are also available for hire. If you require audio editing, mixing, and cleaning up interview recordings prior to publication, please visit mondomark.com for more info and to hear demo reels. Until next time, this is Mark R. Hassan, editor of KQEK.com. This podcast is copyrighted 2016 by Mark R. Hassan.